The cemetery was silent that morning, except for the wind whispering through old oak trees and the distant sound of birds calling to one another. A black limousine pulled through the iron gates, its tires crunching on gravel as it made its way down the narrow path between rows of headstones. The driver opened the door, and a woman in her early 60s stepped out, dressed in mourning black, carrying white lilies in hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to keep them steady. Victoria Bennett had come to visit her husband's grave, as she did every month without fail. The man she'd built an empire beside, the man she'd loved for 38 years, the man she'd buried 2 years ago after his heart gave out during a board meeting. But what she found there that day, a homeless woman crying beside a little child, would uncover a secret her wealth could never buy and her heart wasn't prepared to carry. By the time the truth came out, her carefully constructed world would crumble, and everything she thought she knew about her life would be revealed as nothing more than a beautiful lie. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was that mother kneeling in the dirt beside the polished marble headstone? What was she doing at the grave of one of the wealthiest men in Georgia, a man whose funeral had been attended by senators and CEOs, a man whose obituary had made the front page of every major newspaper in the South? And what did the child she carried, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, have to do with Victoria's past or her husband's carefully guarded secrets? Today's story is about love and betrayal. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes, what we bury 6 feet under refuses to stay buried, no matter how much dirt we pile on top. It's about a woman who had everything except the one thing that mattered, and a homeless mother who had nothing except the truth that would change everything. Victoria Bennett, 61 years old, widow of billionaire industrialist Richard Bennett, stood as one of the most formidable women in American business. They called her the Steel Magnolia in the boardrooms of Atlanta, a nickname that captured both her southern grace and her absolute unwillingness to bend. Her late husband's death had left her with a manufacturing empire worth $3 billion, 6 properties across 3 states, and a reputation that made younger executives nervous when she walked into a room. But what Richard's death hadn't left her with was peace. Every single month since his passing, Victoria made the same pilgrimage to Oakwood Cemetery on the outskirts of Savannah. Same day, the 15th. Same time, 9 in the morning. Same flowers, white lilies, his favorite. It was routine, ritual, and if she was being honest with herself in those quiet moments alone, it was also regret. Her past flickered through her mind as she walked the familiar path that morning. Richard's laughter, deep and genuine, from their early days when they were building the company from nothing. Their son, Christopher, taken from them in a car accident when he was only 23, a wound that never fully healed and left a permanent silence between her and Richard. A life built on power and appearances, on charity galas and corporate acquisitions, on maintaining the perfect image of success while the warmth slowly drained from their marriage until all that remained was polite conversation and separate bedrooms. For all her wealth, for all the power she wielded in business, Victoria Bennett was a lonely queen ruling over an empty kingdom. She had learned to wear her loneliness like armor, to transform it into something hard and impenetrable, to convince herself that dignity and strength were adequate substitutes for human connection. The other widows at her country club spoke about their grief in hushed tones over afternoon tea, but Victoria had never been one to share her feelings with anyone. She grieved alone, visited the grave alone, and went home to her mansion alone. That morning felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The air carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with the humidity. As her heels clicked against the stone pathway leading to Richard's plot, she noticed something that made her slow her pace. Someone was already there, kneeling in front of the grave she'd visited dozens of times in solitude. A young woman, her clothes dirty and worn, clutching a child who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Both of them were crying. Victoria stopped 20 feet away, her grip tightening on the lilies. Her first emotion wasn't concern or curiosity but rather a cold flash of anger. This was her space, her private ritual, her one place in the world where she didn't have to perform or pretend. And here was this stranger, this intruder, violating that sacred privacy. She drew herself up to her full height, channeling every ounce of authority she'd cultivated over decades in the business world. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the morning air with practiced precision. "This is private property, and you're trespassing on my family's plot." The young woman looked up, and Victoria saw her face clearly for the first time. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark circles under red-rimmed eyes and cheekbones that were too prominent, suggesting she hadn't been eating regularly. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her clothes, though clean, were clearly secondhand and had seen better days. The little boy in her arms had his face buried against her shoulder, his small body shaking with quiet sobs. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the woman said, her voice rough from crying. "I didn't know anyone was coming. I'll leave right away. I just needed to talk to him one more time." Something about those words, about the intimacy they implied, sent a chill down Victoria's spine despite the warm morning. "Talk to him?" she repeated, her voice dropping into a dangerous register. "Talk to whom exactly?" The young woman struggled to her feet, trying to maintain her grip on the child while wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I come here because this was my husband's resting place too," she said quietly, and then added words that would shatter Victoria's world into pieces. "Richard was my son's father." The lilies fell from Victoria's hands, scattering across the grass. Time seemed to slow down as the meaning of those words sank in, each one hitting like a physical blow. "My husband?" Her mind repeated the words, unable to process them. "What did you just say?" But she'd heard clearly enough. The woman had called Richard her husband. Had claimed that the child, that little boy with his face hidden, was Richard's son. "That's impossible," Victoria heard herself say, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "You're lying. Richard would never," but the sentence died in her throat because even as she said it, memories were surfacing. Late nights when Richard claimed to be working. Business trips that seemed to extend for no clear reason. The way he'd been spending more time at their Atlanta office rather than their Savannah home in the years before he died. The charitable foundation he'd insisted on starting, focused on helping single mothers, which she'd thought was just another tax strategy. The young woman, seeing Victoria's world crumbling, seemed to shrink into herself. "My name is Amber Hayes," she said softly. "And this is Calvin. I'm not here to cause you trouble, Mrs. Bennett. I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted Calvin to know where his daddy was buried, to tell him goodbye properly because Richard died before he could meet him." Victoria's legs felt weak, but she refused to show it. "Prove it," she demanded, her voice hard despite the trembling she felt inside. "Prove what you're saying is true, or I'll have you arrested for harassment and trespassing right now." Amber shifted Calvin to her hip and reached into the worn canvas bag hanging from her shoulder. She pulled out a manila envelope, wrinkled and stained but carefully preserved. "I don't want to hurt you more than this already has," she said, holding it out with a shaking hand. "But Richard made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure you knew the truth." "He felt guilty, Mrs. Bennett. He wanted to tell you himself, but he kept saying he needed more time, needed to find the right moment." Victoria didn't want to take the envelope. Didn't want to open it. Didn't want to know what was inside because once she knew, she could never unknow it. But her hand reached out anyway, operating on autopilot, and she found herself pulling out the papers inside. A DNA test, dated 3 months before Richard's death, confirming with 99.9% certainty that Richard Bennett was the biological father of Calvin Hayes. A handwritten letter in Richard's distinctive scrawl, addressed to Victoria, beginning with the words, "My dearest Victoria, I am a coward and a fool." The cemetery tilted sideways. Victoria's vision blurred at the edges. She heard herself making a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, a sound she'd never made before in her life. All those years. 38 years of marriage. And here was proof, undeniable and cruel, that for at least some of those years, her husband had been living a completely separate life. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching right now." Let's see who's truly following until the end. Victoria left the cemetery that day without laying the lilies on Richard's grave. She couldn't bring herself to do it, couldn't perform that ritual of love and loss when everything she'd believed about her marriage had just been revealed as fiction. She had her driver take her home, where she locked herself in Richard's study and read the letter he'd written, every painful word of it, 3 times before she finally believed what it said. Richard had met Amber 6 years before his death at a non-profit event the company was sponsoring. She'd been a volunteer, recently divorced, struggling to make ends meet while working 2 jobs. He'd been drawn to her kindness, he wrote, to the way she genuinely cared about helping people rather than advancing her career or social status. What started as conversations over coffee had become something more. He claimed he'd fallen in love with her, though he couldn't bring himself to leave Victoria. The affair had continued for 3 years before Amber became pregnant with Calvin. In the letter, Richard explained that he'd wanted to do right by both families. He'd set up a trust fund for Calvin, established in secret, that would provide for the boy's education and needs. He'd rented an apartment for Amber in Atlanta so he could visit them regularly. He'd even started divorce proceedings twice but backed out both times, unable to face the public scandal and, he admitted, unable to hurt Victoria despite having already betrayed her in the worst possible way. The letter ended with an apology that felt hollow and insufficient. "I loved you both," Richard had written. "I know that sounds impossible, like a coward's excuse, and perhaps that's exactly what it is. But it's the truth. I was too weak to choose, too selfish to let either of you go, too afraid to face the consequences of my actions. If you're reading this, then I've died without finding the courage to tell you myself. I'm sorry, Victoria. I'm sorry for wasting your years, for making you love a lie, for being less than the man you deserved." Victoria's initial shock transformed into something colder and harder over the following days. She had her lawyers investigate Amber Hayes thoroughly, and what they found confirmed the story but also revealed more. The trust fund Richard had established was genuine, containing $2 million designated for Calvin's care. But Richard had died suddenly, and in the chaos of settling his estate, the trust had been frozen along with everything else. Amber had been trying to access it for months but had been blocked by the legal team handling Richard's affairs, team members who reported directly to Victoria. What Victoria discovered next made her blood run cold with a mixture of shame and fury. Amber had lost her apartment 4 months ago when she could no longer afford the rent without Richard's support. She'd been fired from her job when her living situation became unstable and she couldn't maintain reliable childcare for Calvin. She and her son had been staying in shelters, sometimes sleeping in her car when shelter space wasn't available, surviving on food stamps and the charity of strangers while millions of dollars that Richard had designated for them sat inaccessible in legal limbo. Instead of compassion, instead of recognizing that this woman and child were victims of Richard's deception just as she was, Victoria felt only rage. This woman had stolen her husband's love. This child was living proof that her marriage had been a sham. And now they wanted Richard's money too? Wanted to take what Victoria had helped build, what she'd sacrificed for, what had cost her the best years of her life. Using her position as executor of Richard's estate and her connections throughout Georgia's legal system, Victoria moved to dissolve the trust. She argued that Richard had established it while of unsound mind, that Amber had manipulated him, that there was no proof Calvin was really his son despite the DNA test. She threw every resource at her disposal into the fight, not because she needed the money, $2 million was pocket change compared to her wealth, but because she needed to punish them. Victoria told herself she was protecting Richard's legacy. She told herself she was preventing this woman from profiting off an affair. She told herself that Calvin would be fine, that America had safety nets for struggling single mothers, that it wasn't her responsibility to clean up Richard's mess. But deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, she knew the truth. She was destroying them because she could. Because her pride demanded it. Because if she couldn't have Richard's love, then neither could Amber. The legal battle dragged on for months. Victoria's lawyers were relentless and expensive, filing motion after motion, demanding documentation that Amber couldn't provide, stretching the proceedings out until Amber simply couldn't keep fighting. The public defender assigned to help her was overworked and underpaid, no match for Victoria's team. Eventually, the trust was dissolved, the money absorbed back into Richard's estate and ultimately into Victoria's control. Victoria should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt hollow. The night after the final court decision came through in her favor, she opened a bottle of wine that cost more than Amber probably earned in 6 months and drank alone in the empty mansion that suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a home. She'd won, but the victory tasted like ash. Meanwhile, Amber and Calvin's situation grew desperate. Without the trust fund and without any other family support, they bounced between shelters across Savannah and Atlanta. Amber took whatever work she could find, cleaning houses, washing dishes, anything that would allow her to keep Calvin with her. But the instability took its toll. Calvin, who'd been a happy, energetic 4-year-old when Victoria first met him at the cemetery, became quiet and withdrawn. Amber's health deteriorated from stress and poor nutrition. Victoria heard occasional updates through her lawyers, delivered in dry language that stripped away the human cost of her revenge. Amber Hayes had been cited for sleeping in her car in a Walmart parking lot. Amber Hayes had been hospitalized for exhaustion. Amber Hayes had applied for emergency housing assistance and been placed on a 2-year waiting list. She tried to justify her actions in 100 different ways. She'd worked her entire adult life alongside Richard, sacrificing her own career ambitions to support his. She'd lost her only child and somehow found the strength to continue. She'd earned every penny of that estate through blood, sweat, and tears. Why should she hand any of it over to some woman who'd been nothing more than Richard's midlife crisis, his moment of weakness? Why should she care what happened to them when no one had cared about the years of her life that Richard had stolen? But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Victoria found herself thinking about the little boy. Calvin hadn't chosen any of this. He hadn't asked to be born from an affair. He hadn't asked for his father to die before meeting him. He hadn't asked for his mother to lose everything while fighting for what his father had wanted him to have. Calvin was innocent, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Victoria knew she was punishing a child for his father's sins. She pushed the thoughts away. She increased her charitable donations, as if writing checks to faceless organizations could somehow balance the scales. She threw herself into work, expanding the company, making more money she didn't need. She maintained her monthly visits to Richard's grave, though now she went in the afternoons instead of the mornings, irrationally afraid she might encounter Amber again. 3 years passed. The business grew. Victoria's wealth expanded. She was named one of the most powerful women in American business by Forbes. But the emptiness grew too, metastasizing like cancer until some days she could barely remember why any of it had mattered in the first place. Then came a cold November evening when her housekeeper answered an unexpected knock at the front door. Victoria was in the library, reviewing quarterly reports and trying not to think about the fact that Thanksgiving was approaching and she'd be spending it alone, as she had for the past 2 years. She heard voices at the door, her housekeeper's concerned tone, and then footsteps approaching the library. "Mrs. Bennet," her housekeeper said, her usually composed face troubled, "there's a young man here to see you. He says it's important. He says his name is Calvin Hayes." Victoria's heart stopped. Calvin? The little boy from the cemetery would be 7 now, maybe 8. Why would he be here? She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that wanted to shake, and walked to the foyer. What she found there wasn't the small child she remembered, but a grown child whose pain she had caused. He was thin and obviously tired, but holding himself with careful dignity. "I'm sorry to come to your home like this, Mrs. Bennet," he said, his voice polite but strained. "I know you didn't want to see us again. But I needed to tell you something in person. My mother died 2 weeks ago." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Amber was dead? She was only 33, far too young. How? The question escaped before she could stop it. Calvin's jaw tightened. "The official cause was pneumonia," he said. "But really she died from being tired. From working 3 jobs while we lived in a shelter. From skipping meals to make sure I could eat. From the stress of watching me grow up homeless because someone decided we didn't deserve what my father wanted us to have." Victoria felt her face flush. "I don't have to listen to this," she started to say, but Calvin cut her off. "You're right, you don't. You can close the door in my face just like you closed the door on us. But before you do, I want you to know that I didn't come here for your money. I came because my mother's last words to me were about you. Do you want to know what she said?" Victoria didn't answer, couldn't answer, but Calvin continued anyway. "She said, 'Promise me you'll forgive the woman who destroyed us.' Those were the last coherent words my mother spoke before she died. Not, 'I love you,' though I knew she did. Not goodbye. But forgiveness. Forgiveness for you. I've spent 2 weeks trying to understand why, trying to understand how she could forgive someone who took everything from us, who had so much and still needed to take what little we had." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, an old photograph, creased and faded. He held it out to Victoria with a shaking hand. "This is the only picture I have of my father. My mother kept it hidden all these years because she was afraid someone would take it from us, like everything else got taken. That's my dad holding me when I was 2 days old. That's my mom next to him, looking at him like he hung the moon. That's the family I never got to have because he was already married to you, and then because he died, and then because you made sure we paid for his mistakes." Victoria took the photograph with numb fingers. The image showed a younger Richard, his face soft with an emotion she'd rarely seen in their later years together. Genuine, unguarded joy. He was cradling an infant wrapped in a blue blanket, and Amber stood beside him, her eyes shining with love as she looked at Richard. They looked like a family. They looked happy. They looked like everything Victoria's marriage hadn't been for decades. "Why would she want you to forgive me?" Victoria heard herself whisper. "After everything I did?" Calvin's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "Because she loved my father and she knew you did too. Because she understood what it felt like to lose him. Because she spent 3 years being angry, being bitter, and it didn't bring him back or make anything better. She said anger was like drinking poison and waiting for someone else to die. She said she didn't want me to carry that poison. She wanted me to be free of it. What would you have done in this situation? Could you forgive someone who took everything from you? Comment below and let us know your thoughts." Victoria's legs gave out. She sank onto the bench by the door, still clutching the photograph, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "She should have hated me," she said. "I destroyed her. I took money she desperately needed and kept it out of spite. I knew what I was doing. I knew you were in shelters and I told myself it wasn't my problem. She should have hated me." "She did for a while," Calvin said quietly. "We both did. But hate takes energy, Mrs. Bennet, and we didn't have energy to spare. We needed every bit we had just to survive. So eventually the hate turned into something else. Sadness mostly. Sadness for all of us, for what could have been different if people had just been kinder to each other." Victoria looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. He had Richard's eyes, that same shade of gray-green that she'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. He had Richard's jawline too, and the way he held himself, that careful control over emotions that Richard had perfected in boardrooms and business negotiations. This was her husband's son. Her husband's child. Not some abstract concept or legal problem, but a real person who'd suffered because of her choices. "She taught me something else too," Calvin continued. "She taught me that my father was complicated, that people can love more than one person, that adults make mistakes that kids end up paying for. She never spoke badly about him even when we were sleeping in the car. She said he'd been a good man who made bad choices, and that we all do that sometimes. She said you were probably a good woman who made bad choices too, out of hurt and anger." "I wasn't good," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "I was cruel. I had everything, more money than I could ever spend, properties I never visit, investments I don't even keep track of, and I still needed to take from you. Needed to punish you and your mother for existing, for being proof that my marriage was a lie. Your mother was a better person than I'll ever be." Calvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She also wanted me to give you this." He pulled out an envelope, sealed but clearly old, the paper yellowed with time. "She wrote this 2 years ago when things were really bad. She kept updating it, kept adding to it. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I'd make sure you got it. She said you needed to read it, even if you never wanted to see us again." Victoria took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in neat, careful handwriting. She wanted to open it immediately and never open it at all. She wanted to know what Amber had written and was terrified of finding out. "I should go," Calvin said. "I've taken up enough of your time. I just needed to keep my promise to her. I needed you to know that she forgave you, even if you can't forgive yourself." "Wait," Victoria said, standing up quickly. "Please, don't go yet. She struggled to find words adequate to the moment, to the magnitude of what she'd done and what she needed to say. "I can't undo what I did. I can't bring your mother back. I can't give you back the childhood you should have had. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly deeply sorry. And I need to know, what happened to you after she died? Where are you living?" Calvin's expression was guarded. "I'm 18 now, so I aged out of the foster system pretty quickly. I've got a part-time job at a grocery store. I'm staying in a room at a boarding house. It's not much, but it's better than where we were." "College?" Victoria asked. "Plans for the future?" He shrugged. "I can't afford college. Barely finished high school with all the moving around we did. I'm just trying to figure out how to get through next week, next month. That's about as far ahead as I can think right now." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt like ice finally beginning to crack. "Stay here," she said. "Just for a moment. Please." She went back to the library, her mind racing. She'd spent 3 years punishing these people, 3 years nursing her wounded pride and righteous anger. And where had it gotten her? She was alone in a mansion full of beautiful things she didn't care about, successful by every measure that society valued but utterly empty inside. Meanwhile, a young man who'd done nothing wrong was working at a grocery store and living in a boarding house, his whole life constrained by circumstances that weren't his fault. She pulled out her phone and called her personal attorney, despite the late hour. "Frank, it's Victoria Bennet. I need you to draft some documents first thing tomorrow morning." "Yes, I know it's Thanksgiving week. This can't wait. I'll explain everything when you get here at 8 a.m. That night, Victoria sat in her bedroom and finally opened the letter Amber had written. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, words crossed out and rewritten, the physical evidence of someone struggling to express complicated emotions. Victoria read through tears that she didn't bother wiping away, each word landing like a stone in her heart. Amber's letter wasn't angry or accusatory. It was reflective and sad, the words of someone who'd had time to think about all the ways things could have gone differently. She wrote about meeting Richard, about falling in love with him despite knowing he was married, about the guilt she felt for being part of destroying Victoria's marriage. She wrote about the joy of having Calvin, about how Richard had promised to provide for them but had died before he could tell Victoria the truth. "I'm not writing this to make you feel sorry for me," one section read. "I made my own choices just like Richard made his and just like you're making yours now. I'm writing because I want you to understand that Calvin is innocent in all of this. He didn't ask to be born into this situation. He didn't do anything to deserve the life he's lived since his father died. Whatever anger you feel toward me, whatever hurt Richard caused you, please don't let my son pay for it his whole life." The letter went on, page after page of Amber's reflections on love, betrayal, forgiveness, and the ways that hurt people hurt other people in endless cycles. She wrote about the anger she'd felt toward Victoria at first, about the bitterness that consumed her after losing the court case. But then she wrote about a shift that happened somewhere along the way. "I realized I was spending whatever energy I had left being angry at you," she wrote, "and that anger wasn't hurting you at all. You were in your mansion, living your life, probably not thinking about us at all. The only person my anger was hurting was me and by extension my son. So I decided to let it go. Not because you deserved forgiveness but because I deserved peace." The final pages were the hardest to read. Amber must have written them recently, maybe even in her final days. Her handwriting was shakier, the words more stark. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and Calvin is alone. I'm asking you, Victoria, begging you really, to help him. Not because you owe me anything, because you don't. Not because Richard would have wanted you to, though he would have. But because Calvin is a good kid who deserves a chance at a real life. He's smart and kind and hardworking, everything a mother could hope for in a son. He's also your late husband's child, which makes him family whether you want to acknowledge it or not. I forgive you for what you did to us," the letter concluded. "I hope that somehow, someday you'll be able to forgive yourself. I hope you'll be able to forgive Richard too for putting all of us in this impossible situation. And mostly, I hope you'll find it in your heart to give Calvin the opportunities that he should have had all along. He's a Bennett, even if he's never been able to use that name. He deserves better than what he's gotten so far." Victoria read the letter 3 times that night, and each time she felt something inside her shift and change. She'd spent 3 years convinced she was the victim, the wronged party, the one who deserved sympathy and support. And she had been wronged. Richard's betrayal was real, and the pain of discovering his affair was genuine. But she'd taken that pain and used it as justification to cause more pain, to punish people who were suffering just as much as she was, if not more. Over the following days, Victoria moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She met with Frank, her attorney, and restructured her estate planning. She established a new trust for Calvin, larger than the one Richard had originally created, with provisions for his education, housing, and future. She also established a foundation in Amber's name, dedicated to helping homeless single mothers access housing, education, and job training. But she didn't just write checks and walk away. That would have been too easy, another way of keeping distance between herself and the consequences of her actions. Instead, she asked Calvin if he'd be willing to meet with her again, to talk about his mother and his father and the future. She expected him to refuse, to take the money she was offering and cut all ties with her. She wouldn't have blamed him if he had. But Calvin said yes. They met at a coffee shop, neutral territory where neither of them had to perform or pretend. They talked for 4 hours that first time, and then they met again the next week and the week after that. Slowly, painfully, they began to build something that resembled a relationship. Victoria learned about the little boy she'd seen crying at the cemetery, learned about his love of books and his skill with numbers, about the ways he tried to take care of his mother even when he was too young to really help. Calvin learned about the son Victoria had lost, about Christopher who died so young and left such a massive hole in her life. He learned about the lonely years of her marriage, about the ways she and Richard had drifted apart long before Amber entered the picture. He learned that Victoria was human, flawed and damaged and trying to do better even though she'd done so much wrong. 6 months after that first knock on Victoria's door, she attended Calvin's high school graduation ceremony. He'd been able to finish his senior year at a good school, living in a small apartment the trust provided, focusing on his studies instead of survival. He graduated with honors and gave a speech that made Victoria cry for all the right reasons. "My mother taught me that our circumstances don't define us," Calvin said to his classmates. "That we can choose how we respond to pain, to loss, to injustice. She taught me that forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook for their actions. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying anger around everywhere you go. And she taught me that it's never too late for people to change, to make different choices, to become better versions of themselves." After the ceremony, Calvin introduced Victoria to his classmates as his stepmother. She didn't correct him even though the title wasn't legally accurate. In the ways that mattered, it was true enough. She'd stepped into a maternal role in his life, not replacing Amber but honoring her memory by helping her son become the man she'd hoped he'd be. A year after their first meeting, Victoria and Calvin visited the cemetery together for the first time. They stood in front of Richard's grave, each lost in their own complicated feelings about the man buried there. Calvin placed a photograph on the headstone, the picture of him as an infant with Richard and Amber, all of them smiling. Victoria placed her white lilies next to it. "Your father loved you," Victoria said quietly, the words difficult but necessary. "He loved you and your mother. That doesn't excuse what he did, doesn't make the lying and the deception okay. But I spent years pretending that love wasn't real, that you and Amber were just some mistake he made. That was wrong. You were his family too." Calvin nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He loved you too, you know. My mom told me that. She said he was torn up about hurting you, that he never wanted to cause you pain." "I know," Victoria said. "I read his letter. I just wish he'd been brave enough to tell me the truth while he was alive. We could have worked something out, found some way to make it less terrible for everyone. Instead, we all ended up losing." They stood in silence for a long moment, grieving not just for Richard but for all the years of pain and anger and wasted opportunities. Then Victoria reached out and took Calvin's hand, and they grieved together. "Your mother was remarkable," Victoria said. "I spent years hating her without ever knowing her, and that was my loss. She raised an incredible young man despite circumstances that would have broken most people. She deserved so much better than what she got, from Richard and especially from me." "She'd be happy that we're here together," Calvin said. "She always hoped for something like this, even when it seemed impossible. She believed people could change, could forgive, could find ways to heal. I didn't believe her for a long time, but she was right." Victoria had funded Calvin's college education at Georgia Tech, where he was studying business administration with plans to eventually help run the foundation she'd established in his mother's name. They had dinner together every Sunday, a ritual that filled some of the loneliness that had haunted Victoria's mansion for so long. She'd met his girlfriend, a kind young woman who reminded Victoria a bit of Amber, and gave them her blessing when Calvin nervously asked for it. The house wasn't empty anymore. The company wasn't just a monument to business success but was actively funding programs that helped people like Amber and Calvin had once been. Victoria had stopped trying to control everything and had learned to trust Calvin's instincts, his experiences, his understanding of what struggling families actually needed. She wasn't the same woman who dropped those lilies in the cemetery before she met them. That Victoria had been hard and cold, wrapped in her pride like armor, convinced that her pain justified any cruelty she inflicted on others. The woman she'd become was softer, more uncertain in some ways but also more real. She'd learned that strength wasn't about never bending, never showing weakness, never admitting you were wrong. Real strength was in facing the ugliest parts of yourself and choosing to do better. One evening, as they sat in Victoria's library reviewing applications for the Foundation's scholarship program, Calvin looked up from the papers and said, "You know, I used to dream about what I'd say to you if I ever got the chance. I had this whole speech planned about how you destroyed my childhood, how you'd killed my mother through stress and hardship, how you were a monster hiding behind money and respectability." Victoria set down her pen, her chest tight. "I was all those things," she said quietly. "I don't think I'm a monster anymore, or at least I'm trying not to be. But I was then. Everything you thought about me was true." "That's not actually what I wanted to say," Calvin continued. "What I wanted to say is that I'm glad I never gave that speech. Because if I'd come to your door with anger instead of my mother's message, we wouldn't be here right now. You would have closed the door and I would have walked away and we both would have stayed trapped in that cycle of hurt and revenge. My mom breaking that cycle, choosing forgiveness even when you didn't deserve it, that saved both of us." Victoria felt tears welling up as they often did these days. She'd spent years learning not to cry, teaching herself that emotions were weakness, that vulnerability was dangerous. Now she cried regularly and somehow that felt like healing. "Your mother was a better person than I could ever hope to be," she said. "But I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to live up to the forgiveness she gave me." "That's all any of us can do," Calvin said. "None of us are perfect. We all hurt people, make mistakes, let our pain turn us into people we don't want to be. The question is what we do after. Whether we stay in that place or whether we try to climb out of it." "I visit her grave sometimes," Calvin said suddenly. "My mom's. It's in a county cemetery about 30 miles from here. Nothing fancy, just a simple marker. I couldn't afford anything more when she died." "I'd like to visit with you sometime," Victoria said. "If you'd be comfortable with that." I'd like to pay my respects, to tell her thank you for raising such a good son and for teaching him to break cycles instead of continuing them. Calvin nodded. I think she'd like that. And I think there's something else she'd want. What's that? She'd want you to forgive him too, Calvin said, gesturing toward a photograph of Richard that still sat on Victoria's desk. My dad. You've spent years being angry at him and I get it, what he did was wrong. But holding on to that anger isn't hurting him. He's gone. It's only hurting you. Victoria looked at the photograph, at Richard's face frozen in time, forever 58 years old and unaware of all the pain his choices would cause. I don't know if I can, she admitted. Forgiving you and your mother is different. You were innocent. She was at least honest about what she wanted. But Richard lied to both of us for years. He took the coward's way out, dying before he had to face the consequences of his choices. You're right, Calvin said. And you don't have to forgive him today or next week or maybe ever. But I'll tell you what my therapist told me, and yes, I'm in therapy now thanks to the trust you set up. She said that forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was okay. It's about deciding not to let what they did control your life anymore. It's about putting down the weight you've been carrying. Victoria sat with those words for a long time after Calvin left that evening. She thought about the weight she'd been carrying, 38 years of marriage, years of widowhood, years of revenge, and now almost 2 years of trying to make amends. So much of her life had been defined by Richard, by his choices, by her reactions to those choices. She'd let him shape her into someone hard and cruel. That Christmas, Victoria hosted dinner at her home for the first time in years. Calvin came with his girlfriend. Several of the foundation's scholarship recipients came, young people who had nobody else to spend the holidays with. Victoria's housekeeper joined them too, no longer just an employee but someone who'd watched Victoria transform and had become something like a friend in the process. The dining room that had sat empty for so long was full of life, full of conversation and laughter and the sound of people who'd found family in unexpected places. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Victoria was alone again in the big house, she stood in front of Richard's photograph one more time. She'd moved it from her desk to a shelf, no longer the centerpiece of the room but still present, still acknowledged. I forgive you, she said quietly to the image. Not because what you did was okay, it wasn't. Not because I've forgotten the pain you caused, I haven't. But because I'm tired of carrying this anger around. I'm tired of letting your choices define my life. You were a complicated man who made terrible decisions, and you hurt people who loved you. You were also human, capable of love even if you didn't know how to handle it responsibly. I forgive you for being imperfect. And I forgive myself for being imperfect too. She turned off the light and walked upstairs, feeling lighter than she had in years. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the heavy silence of loneliness but the peaceful quiet of a space waiting to be filled again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. So what would you have done in Victoria's place? If you discovered your spouse had a secret family, if you had the power to punish them or help them, which would you choose? Would you be able to find forgiveness when someone had taken so much from you? Could you accept forgiveness from someone you'd harmed so deeply? Like this video if you believe people can change. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that explore the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of being human. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose differently, to break cycles of hurt, to become the person you wish you'd been all along. Until then, remember, you're not defined by your worst moments. You're defined by what you do after them. And it's never, ever too late to choose better. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And we'll see you in the next video.